Hi, class. It is time for Module 9, Objectives 1 and 2. I hope you're having an awesome day so far. And without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and get to it. All right. So, Module 9 is about social and cultural foundations. And we're going to talk about some of the social and cultural foundations behind substance use. So let's get right into those objectives. Objective number 1, we're going to discuss the social and cultural perspectives on the intersection of stigma, medicalization, and the profits in drug treatments. Who's making some money? Number 2, which we'll talk about today, is to explain the cross-cultural reasons people give for using substances. So when we hear it from people's own mouths why they use substances, what do we hear? Number 3, recognize and give examples of upstream and downstream determinants of substance use. And number 4, explain the importance of upstream determinants in the opioid epidemic. And we'll kind of use that as a case study. That'll be next time. In the next video, we'll do 3 and 4. But for now, objectives 1 and 2. So objective 1, as I just said, is to discuss some of the socio-cultural perspectives on the intersection of stigma, medicalization, and profits in drug treatment. First off, what is the socio-cultural perspective? Well, the socio-cultural perspective kind of concentrates on broader issues in substance use, what we call as macro level issues. And that's the contributions of societies to individual behavior, to substance using behavior. So, for example, politics, laws. What's the contribution of laws? What laws regulate availability of substances to a large extent? For example, laws regarding alcohol and tobacco and marijuana, and culture, other cultural effects. And we're going to talk a lot about the culture of capitalism in the U.S. That creates a corporate effect on individual behavior. Okay, so for example, you could ask from a sociocultural perspective, how does the widespread legalization of marijuana affect cannabis use in the United States? Is cannabis use going up because of legalization? Is it going up in vulnerable groups, for example, like pregnant women or minors, under the age of legal use? So first, let's talk a little bit about stigma. Addiction is still stigmatized in society. And we talked about addiction being seen as an immoral sort of thing. And that idea is still out there. Substance users are really often considered to be dangerous, unpredictable, they're manipulative, they'll lie to you, they'll steal. They are often seen as to blame for their choices to use drugs or to become addicted to drugs. Many times we have this sort of corresponding ideas about drug users where they should be both pitied as, oh, they have a disease and they're in terrible shape, but they're also feared as dangerous. There's a lot of prejudice and discrimination that plays into this. So, for example, when you take a controlled study where you have one group that's both groups are given a scenario of a person who's addicted to drugs, but in one group, the person who's addicted is of a racial minority group, for example, Black or African American. And then the other one is white, but otherwise it's the exact same story. What you find, you have people, evaluate, well, what would you do? What do you recommend in this case? And they find that people are hold more blame if the person is brown or Black. And also think that they deserve more punishment, where white people are seen in the same situation as deserving help. So there's a problem there. We have some of these racial biases that feed into that stigma. We have healthcare professionals that are still using a lot of stigmatizing language like drug abuse and addict and things like that, alcoholic. What we see in large scale surveys is that about 82%, and I mean, this is a lot of people, you know what I mean? More than 4 out of 5 people with substance use disorders do not seek treatment. Now, this is for a lot of different reasons. Maybe because they don't want treatment, maybe because they don't have health insurance that'll cover treatment and stuff like that. But one of those reasons is stigma. They don't want to come out as admitting that they have a substance use disorder because people will think badly of them. And even healthcare workers may think badly of them. Okay, well, I want to just emphasize, and we talked about it at the very beginning of class, that names are can be used as a sort of power and ability to sort of control the identity. So names are very, very important. I think I talked to you before in the very beginning of class about avoiding the words abuse and abuser, drug abuse, drug abuser. That contributes to the stigma. And in fact, it decreases the likelihood that someone is going to seek help. If part of the thing is that they feel blamed for it. It focuses on the person rather than the problem. You are the abuser. You have done this actively, right? Rather than the substance being an addictive substance or the environment that played into the addiction, the family, the larger environment, the neighborhood, the society, as we'll talk about in this section. The other problem is that substance abuse is not a medical condition. The condition that DSM-5 recognizes is called substance use disorder, not abuse. Okay. There's a study that's, I think, interesting by Kelly and Westerhoff, where they varied the description of a substance user. And again, this is the same kind of scenario. They give the same description of a substance user, but in one of them they call it a person with substance use disorder, and the other one they call it a substance abuser. In the abuser condition, where they were called an abuser, people ascribe more blame to them. They did it to themselves, and they want more punishment, more punitive measures that they recommend. So just those words really do make a difference in how people, we perpetuate that kind of stigma. Well, another big issue is what we call the medicalization of addiction. So addiction, when it was considered to be a disease, when it started to heavily be considered not as an immoral condition, but as a disease, we started to diagnose it. And diagnosis is a formal standard practice. You've seen the DSM criteria. We go through one criteria at a time. And we do it all the time with people to see whether they have substance use disorder. It's a focus on the medical rather than the immoral perspective or the disease perspective. But even in the DSM, there's been a lot of changes over time. So, for example, in the previous version of the DSM, there were actually two disorders. One was substance dependence and the other was substance abuse, and those differed in severity. Both of those terms had more of a sense of a sort of moral judgment, right? And we talked about that with the term abuse. So in the DSM-5, that was changed to one disorder, substance use disorder, and that's what we've been operating on in this class because the DSM-5 is current. And then we have severity based on the number of symptoms that the person exhibits. So labeling also has a social influence, because as soon as we label something a disorder, we then, it kind of becomes reified or becomes real in some ways. So for example, baldness used to be normal, and obesity used to be normal, and ADHD was just hyperactive kids, and sleep problems now are considered many times to be diseases, right? And in fact, some of these are formal diagnoses, for example, like ADHD, and many of the sleep problems, we do see those in the DSM. Now, the DSM has been growing and growing and growing. We keep calling more and more things disorder. It does have an influence on the way that we see people with these kinds of symptoms. Remember that substance use was not always a disorder. Remember that people were unconcerned about alcohol use. It's not seen as a problem. And many, many other substances were not seen as a problem until, well into the 1800s. So consider also the term happy hour. That has a connotation as well, that alcohol is a happy thing, right? And so the words that we use help to sort of give us a feeling for the right or wrong of substances. Well, the other thing to remember is that addiction is a business. There is a huge treatment industry surrounding addiction. So, for example, there are lots of doctors and therapists who are going to treat addiction, educational institutions like this one that are awarding certification for addiction training or degrees that involve addiction training. There's pharmaceutical companies that are producing drugs for addiction treatment. Basically, all of these entities are profiting from and controlling treatment. So making matters worse, so you can imagine, that many of these entities are going to be invested in considering alcohol use and substance use to be diseases, right? Making matters worse, many doctors and psychologists, therapists have limited training in addictions, very little, in fact, in some cases. And most providers of substance counseling, specifically addiction counseling, may or may not have a master's degree. In Missouri, we require an associate's degree or certification at a minimum, plus 3,000 hours and an exam and some other requirements to become a certified substance use counselor. Well, as you can imagine, just like in every educational enterprise, there are shady kind of profit-driven credentialing that exists. And so the kinds of training that people might get in different institutions may differ quite a bit because people are making money off of this stuff. That's what I'm saying. There's a lot of incentive to make money off of this. And when addiction providers are in control of defining addiction and they're making money off of it, that's a kind of conflict of interest, right? Okay. I want to get into a second thing that sociocultural researchers look at, which is the reasons why people give for using substances. Now, most of this research that we're going to be talking about is what we call qualitative research, where they actually go and talk to people with substance use disorder and get some of their perspectives from their own head, from their own mouth, and those are then interpreted. And this work has been done cross-culturally with the reasons that people are giving for using substances. So I want to go through some of those reasons. They serve many times social functions. So one way, one reason to look at the reasons why people use substances is that to combat the addiction problem, we might want to look at what functions these substances are serving in people's lives, right? To understand the kind of meaning and the purpose behind them. And so I'm going to talk about 5 different cross-cultural functions. I'm going to talk about social facilitation, release from social obligations, repudiation of social norms, marking boundaries, and also crossing boundaries. So the first one is just simply social facilitation. We've talked about this in a previous chapter. Alcohol is acceptable in lots of social and business situations in many, 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 though not all cultures. It is an expected behavior in social settings. This happened to me the other day. A colleague invited me out for a beer expressly at a brewery, and it was at like 4 o'clock in the day, and I had a lot of things to do, and I just thought, well, I don't really want to drink a beer right now. So when I was headed down there, I was thinking oh, I'll just drink some water, or I'll drink a Coke or something like that, because I didn't really want a beer. I didn't really want to have a beer at 4 o'clock. If it was later, I would have, but I had a lot of things I had to do. So at any rate, so I get there, and the guy's like, oh, let me buy you a beer. And I was kind of like in the moment, even though I didn't even want a beer, I just felt like I had to say yes because so I was like, oh, okay, thanks, or whatever. And part of that is like, I didn't want to be seen as stiff or like, like, oh, I don't want to have a beer. Or I'm unable to loosen up or I'm too uptight or whatever. So anyway, there's a lot of social pressure, suffice it to say. A lot of other substances are used in the same way to promote closeness to others, to promote openness. Cannabis and marijuana is used that way. Ecstasy is a real social drug. And we use it at parties and things like that to increase sociability. Okay. Number two big issue, and I'm going to spend the next 3 slides on this, is release from social obligations or stress. People report using substances as a break from stressors and responsibilities in daily life. So these are things we're going to talk about, a couple of reasons why, and one of those is going to be discrimination. But I want you to consider these things that we say. We work hard, we play hard, right? We want to chill out. We want to loosen up. We want to lose control, meaning that we have all this control all the time. And now we just want to lose it. We want to free ourselves from all of that. Okay, first hypothesis I want to talk about is a timeout hypothesis. And that's just taking a timeout from obligations in your life. Maybe you feel like, oh, I should clean my house. I got to take care of my kids. I got to do this. I got to do that. And all those social obligations are just like, whoa, too much. So by the end of the day, I just want a little break from it. I'm going to do some recreational use at the end of the day. Now, this kind of use does not typically interfere with daily life rules, and it's not usually at the level of a substance use disorder. A lot of times these are planned celebrations. I'm going to go to a party on Friday night, to celebrate the weekend or something like that. These can eventually become more serious problems, and especially when we're taking a real prolonged timeout, like you go on a bender for lots of days as a timeout, and so eventually you does get in the way of some of your social obligations, probably. Okay, another example of a release from social obligations and stress is what's called achievement anxiety theory. And that is the idea that we're always feeling like we got to be productive. I don't know about you, but I wake up in the morning and I'm just like, you have to do this and this and this and this today. Come on, get out of bed and do all this crap. And what this does is the idea of using drugs to seek a relief, to turn that off, to say, I'm not going to be productive anymore today, right? So it's this achievement productivity, and that's unique in some ways to the culture of the United States. We have this intense focus on this work ethic, this productivity. You just got to be doing something all the time. You got to be making something all the time. You got to be progressing in your life all the time. And we feel some guilt about not doing that. So drugs and alcohol are used in some ways to turn that off. Once again, these little chemical vacations, they're going to become more frequent. They can be a way of sliding into addiction. Drugs can also be used to enhance productivity. So you probably heard stories of Sigmund Freud's use of cocaine, and he wrote a whole book about it, how wonderful cocaine is and how you can get so much done. And a lot of students nowadays use Adderall in the same way, and other workers use Adderall in the same way. So it can go both ways, a relief from the productivity motive, but also to enhance productivity. But basically, we're freaked out about productivity, okay? And so we use drugs to alter that productivity. Okay, finally, I want to talk about in the last one about release from social obligations. I want to talk about minority stress theory. And this is the idea that in minority groups, and so here we're talking about for example, LGBTQ plus groups, Latinx, African American groups, Native American groups. So these are racial and ethnic minorities, but also sex and gender minorities. We do see high levels of stress because of that minority status. And that's the problem. I mean, the problem literally is that just if you are in a minority group, and especially if you're in a visible minority group, you're going to encounter prejudice and discrimination on the daily. I mean, you're just facing it all the time. And a lot of times it's, what we call microaggression. Somebody looks at you funny. Somebody, assumes that you're a football player because you're Black or whatever, right? And what happens is that people who are facing more of that discrimination, more discriminatory events, and they're feeling more of that kind of prejudice, they are more likely to use substances. And the idea here is that the substances are providing a relief from this chronic stress, because remember, this goes on day after day after day. So to break out of that a little bit, to get a little bit of relief from that, use some substances, right? And this, if you want to pause here, you can kind of look at this kind of flow chart of how minority stress works to create this kind of relief with substance use. Okay, third, I want to talk about repudiation of social norms. People report using drugs and alcohol to go against the grain. It's just like an FU to a lot of conventional norms. Say, I'm not following your rules. You know what I mean? I'm gonna do my own thing. So we see use of illegal drugs as like that people pride themselves on breaking the law, because it's like, well, I'm gonna do my own thing. I'm not playing by your rules. I'm marching to the beat of a different drum. We can see this with college students who say, well, Thursdays are the weekend, or this is syllabus week. I'm not doing crap this week because it's syllabus week, and all of that. You know what I mean? It's this idea that, you know what, your rules are not my rules. I'm not operating by them. With prescriptions, we see anti-label use. That should be label, not libel. And that's this idea that I'm not going to use these drugs the way the doctor told me to use them. I'm going to use them my own way. Also sharing of prescription drugs and things like that. So this repudiation of norms, just going against the norms, they screw you. I'm not operating according to your rules. Okay, a couple more reasons why people use drugs. Number 4 is marking boundaries. Substance use functions as a boundary that marks us versus them, the in-group versus the out-group, right? So my in-group smokes weed, right? And the other people out in the out-group don't smoke weed. Okay, so that might be how you're thinking about it. You probably thought about in-group and out-group ideas at some other level of psychology. But I want to emphasize here that this is tied to discrimination historically. So we look at it, we talked about the temperance movement with alcohol, right? And that eventually led to prohibition around 1920. And what we see with the temperance movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s is that we got this concept of the wets versus the dries, right? So there were wet communities and dry communities, those who used alcohol, those who did not use alcohol, and they were marked by alcohol, but they also marked class. They marked social class, they marked politics, they marked religion, they marked morality. So you can imagine how right now the use of, let's say, for example, marijuana might also do the same thing, right? And that developed a kind of discrimination. If you were a dry, you didn't like the wets. If you were wet, you didn't like the dries, right? Other drugs, for example, in the 1980s, we had these terrible drug policies that dealt with different penalties for crack versus cocaine. Though this was essentially the same drug, crack was associated with an urban population, a Black population. People saw crack as this menace of a drug that deserved really harsh policies, and they had a real criminal response to it. They were going to lock people up over crack. But The penalties for cocaine, which was, again, marking a boundary there. Cocaine was used by white people. The penalties were less so. We were more pitiable toward users of cocaine. In the 1990s and 2000s, we started to see opiate use, and that was taking place largely because of prescription opiates being widely available in a predominantly white male population. And we started to get all these deaths from opiates, and we started to get all this addiction of opiates. Well, all of a sudden the news coverage was covering all this stuff about these shocking tragedies. So and so got a sports injury and was prescribed opiates and now is addicted, and what a terrible, awful thing that was. Again, the drug marked a class boundary, a race boundary there. And then when you had, for example, racial minorities using the drugs, that a lot of times wasn't even covered. You know what I mean? All these shocking, horrible stories about opiates were all about the terrible tragedies that happened among white people early on. Now that's changed somewhat, because there are many, many more racial minorities who have gotten involved in opiate use in the more modern era. Okay. Another reason why people use drugs, and the last one I'm going to talk about, is to cross boundaries. And so I want to talk about this idea of the symbolic mediator. The symbolic mediator is when a substance is used to cross a cultural boundary or a passage of time. So let me talk about that. A cultural boundary might be, for example, hallucinogens are often used this way, but you may even use other drugs this way, right? To cross a cultural boundary, you're getting in with a different group of people, and this is how they do things. And so you do the drug to experience that with them, to experience their culture. And we see that with this woman who has gone to visit a Native American culture, and she's doing ayahuasca in the picture. And now there's this crazy sort of vacation magnet for wealthy Americans to go down to El Salvador and other places to do ayahuasca, which is a hallucinogen. And have this, spiritual experience. Well, that's a cultural boundary, passing a cultural boundary. So that would be an example of that. Passages of time is another symbolic mediator. And that's where, again, the drug serves as a symbol of something. So, for example, at weddings and receptions, we do champagne toasts. At New Year's, after winning a game, things like that. We do, I don't know about you, but I do a heck of a lot of coffee in the morning to transition to wakefulness, to morning time. There's also people do happy hours at the end of the workday, or I think, as I told you before, my mom used to do cocktail hour at home at the end of her workday. And so we use these to commemorate passages of time, and also to cross those kinds of cultural boundaries. So I want you to remember that substances are commodities, and they bring profits. And so a commodity is just some kind of consumable thing that can carry a profit. So if we are, for example, if you think about it, Starbucks is involved in the drug trade, so to speak, because they're making money off of caffeine as a product, right? And so they're convincing you to that you need this. There's a lot of marketing that goes into it, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the next section, which is going to head to objectives 3 and 4. But for now, I am leaving you again. You guys have a great day.